Hello, everybody, and welcome to the beautiful Johannissaal. In case you don't know what this event really is, this is a Young Academy event of the Young Academy of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and this is our only lecture series except for the roadshow, where we take scientists from the Young Academy to the Bundesländer. But this is very special because this is our distinguished lecture series, and it has an exciting format where we want to present cutting-edge research from slightly different angles. So what we do is one of the Young Academy members, in this case it's Anne Sophie Meincke, is inviting one of the world experts on a specific topic that that member is interested in. And then we have both people presenting, and afterwards we have a short panel discussion. And after the panel discussion, you also have the possibility to ask your questions, and we have the possibilities to have people online ask questions as well. This is also the opening event for a conference on the philosophy of free will, which is going to happen tomorrow and the day after in these rooms. So if you are not already signed up for it, you can still join. There are flyers for the event on this table on the edge. Here, yeah. So after the questionnaire is over, we also have the opportunity to go downstairs and have a reception, so you can have more private conversations with the speakers as well. So, to the topic today, this is particularly exciting. I'm very excited about it, to hear about it. It's about the philosophy of free will, and if biology can help us to make arguments on free will. This is particularly interesting to me because I'm a biologist. And I think that biology is interesting because it has been used in the past to make argument in both directions, both against and for free will. So, for example, the interplay between genes and the environment has been used as an argument for determinism, and the evolution of flexible minds and intelligent minds in animals has been used as an argument for free will. And there is evidence from neuroscience that has been used in sort of both directions. But I do not want to take away any more from what the speakers, who are much more expertise than me, are going to say about this. So I'm very honored to introduce our distinguished speaker today, who is Alfred Mele. And he's a very famous analytical philosopher. He specialized on the philosophy of mind, on metaphysics, and on theory of action. And he's got a William H. Lucille T. and Werkmeister Professor of Philosophy at Florida State University. So we are very, very grateful that he came all this way to Vienna to see us. He has written 13 books and over 250 articles. He's led several very large projects on the big questions around free will. And he is one of the major experts on the topic. His previous work is supporting views that biology might affect but does not eliminate free will, as far as I understand. So we are very grateful to have you here, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Is the microphone working fine? Is it good? You can hear me in the back? Okay. I have Parkinson's disease, so it's better for all of us if I give this lecture sitting down. Also, I flew in from Florida yesterday, so I have jet lag. So this will be an interesting kind of experiment. We'll see how it goes. One thing that might happen is I might forget to forward the slides, and maybe you can help me out if you figure that's going on. Every year, I get about, 3 to 5 emails from people who read recently that scientists had shown that there's no free will, and they're quite upset about it. And they ask me whether the scientists are right. And, it's hard to explain in an email why not, but I try sometimes. And I can direct them to things I've written. So this is an issue that people take seriously, and some people take very seriously. And I think that's why I keep at it. And the work that is cited the most or worried about the most in this connection is pretty old work by a neurobiologist named Benjamin Libet. And I'll start with Libet's work and then move on to some successors' work. And it turns out that it's really these kinds of studies that worry people. Nobody ever emails me, by the way, and asks, well, you know, philosophers have shown that there's no free will. Should I worry about that? And I wonder why this is. Okay, so that's my little introduction, and I'm still there, I think. Nope, I need to go forward. And just need a little bit of terminological background. So decisions we're going to understand as momentary mental actions of forming an intention to do a thing. So to decide to pick up this bottle, say instead of that one, is to perform a little mental action of forming an intention to pick that up. And we can think of the intention as what's going to lead me to do it. Intentions, just think about the way you normally do. Turns out people, for the most part, aside from philosophers, think about intentions in pretty much the same way. And then we should make a distinction between proximal and distal decisions and intentions. So a proximal intention is just an intention now to do a thing now, like an intention I have now to clap my hands now. And a distal intention is an intention I have now to do something later, like I might have an intention now to, I don't know, have a drink later. Well, I don't drink alcohol. Have a drink of water later at the reception. Okay, and all of the studies that worry people are about proximal decisions and proximal intentions. Intentions now to do a thing now. Okay, so now a little bit of background so you see what's going on. Some quotations from the literature, and there we go. So first, the brain decides to initiate, or at least to prepare to initiate, certain actions before there is any reportable subjective awareness that such a decision has taken place. This is a claim by Libet, and the idea is that the brain decides unconsciously to do a thing, and then you become aware of the brain's decision later on. So the decision is unconsciously made. Next claim, because brain activity in the supplementary motor area consistently preceded the conscious decision, it has been argued that the brain had already unconsciously made a decision to move even before the subject became aware of it. And that is a repetition, really, of Libet's claim. And then the guys who did this article think they have even better evidence than Libet had for the claim that these decisions are made unconsciously. And I'll talk a bit about that. Then we get a theoretical claim connecting these alleged findings to free will. If the act-now process is initiated unconsciously, then conscious free will is not doing it. So yeah, the idea is if you're deciding unconsciously, if you're not even aware of what you're deciding, then you're not in control of what you're deciding. And if you're not in control of it, you're not deciding freely. That's the claim there. And then we get a generalization claim. Our overall findings do suggest some fundamental characteristics of the simpler acts that may be applicable to all consciously intended acts and even to responsibility and free will. So what he's doing there is generalizing from the alleged findings in his study, and I'll talk about the study shortly, to a claim about all decisions and all intentions. So here's the, let's see, is this a new slide? Yeah. Here's Libet's design in the main experiment. So subjects are seated in chairs, and they're watching a really fast clock. It makes a complete revolution in about 2.5 seconds. And what they're supposed to do is to flex a wrist whenever they want and pay attention to where the hand is on the clock. And then after they flex, the clock is going to stop, and they're supposed to report. So what you do is you move a cursor to the spot on the clock where you think it was when you first felt your intention or decision or wish or will. He uses lots of different terms. The participants or subjects are hooked up to 2 machines. EEG is read from the scalp, and that's changes in electrical conductivity. that show up on the scalp. And then there is a measurement of motion in the wrist muscle. And what Libet discovered when he regularly reminded people to be spontaneous, that is not to plan in advance when to flex, and when after the experiment they didn't report any pre-planning, any pre-intention to do a thing at a particular time, you got a ramp up starting around 550 milliseconds, a little more than half a second before muscle motion. And then the average time of first reported awareness of the mental state or event, the intention, wish, or will, or whatever, was 200 milliseconds before muscle motion. So what Libet said is, well, when the ramp-up starts, that's when the decision is made. So the decision is made a little more than half a second before muscle motion, but the person doesn't become conscious of it until about a third of a second later. And so, he says, the brain is making the decision unconsciously, and then we get the argument. So I'll come back to that shortly. Let's see. Consciousness and the window of opportunity for free won't. It's something I like to talk about, but let's save it, because I might not have time to go through everything. But later on, at the end, if you want to ask me about it, you can just ask about Libet's veto experiment, and I'll tell you about it. Libet wasn't claiming that there's no free will at all. He thought that once you became aware of your decision or intention or urge or whatever to do a thing, you had a tiny window of opportunity to veto the urge, let's say, and not to do the thing in question. In fact, you had about a tenth of a second, he thought. And after that, it was going to be too late, and the urge would plow through and generate the behavior. Okay. All right, so veto stuff later. Now, another experiment, a successor experiment to Libet, was done later with different technology. Libet was using EEG. These guys are using fMRI. So they're measuring changes in blood flow in the brain. And what they had participants do is choose to press a button, the one on the left or the one on the right. Nothing would hang on which button you press. It was arbitrary picking. They're doing a lot of reading of blood flow in the brain when people are doing this. And they say at the end of a lot of training, they were able to predict with high accuracy, 7 to 10 seconds in advance of a button press, which button a person would press. And so they said, well, Libet was able to do this 550 milliseconds in advance. And this isn't real-time prediction, by the way, but let's not worry about that. So Libet was able to do it about a half a second in advance, and they say, but we can do it 7 to 10 seconds in advance. And we'll see what we think about that when we get to it. And then the third kind of experiment I'll briefly talk about is done with epilepsy patients who can't be properly treated with drugs and need surgery. So part of the skull is removed, electrode grids are placed on the skull, and the researchers can get evidence directly from the brain instead of EEG going through the skull, measuring blood flow and the like. And what they discovered is that about 800 milliseconds in advance of muscle motion, within a window of 200 to 300 milliseconds, they could predict when the person would click a mouse button. So they're predicting the time. Okay, with 80% accuracy. So now, and I'll keep track of my slides. There we go. So let's go back to Libet first. So that was the 550 millisecond thing. So what happens at 550 milliseconds? Libet's claim is that at that time, the decision is made. And the evidence that he offers for the claim that the decision is made then is that's when the EEG ramp-up starts. Now, the decision is supposed to be a proximal decision. So it's a decision you make now to flex now. And so what you should be wondering is, hey, how long does it take a decision now to flex now to generate muscle motion? And then what you'd like to do is to get some independent evidence about that. Now, one kind of evidence you can get from just simple go signal studies. So you tell people, when you hear the tone, press a button, right? Something like that. And you see how long it takes. from the sounding of the tone to muscle motion associated with pressing a button. And ideally, you'd want to do this with subjects who are also watching the Libet clock, one of those fast clocks, because then this situation is more like Libet's situation. And when you do it, you get a reaction time of about 230 milliseconds. So 230 milliseconds between the sounding of the tone and the muscle motion. So that puts it within the range of what Libet calls W time, the 200 millisecond window just before motion starts. Also, there was a really nice study done later by Trevina and Miller. Yeah, I'm on the right slide. So what they did is they told subjects to wait until a tone sounded and then decide at that point whether to press the button on the left or the button on the right. So don't decide before you hear the tone. Wait for the tone. When you hear it, decide. Now, if deciding is forming an intention, then the intention is going to come after the tone, shortly after the tone. And you can see how long from the tone to muscle motion. In their case, it was 150 milliseconds. And you might wonder, was the decision made before the tone? Well, it turned out that whether the person pressed the button on the left or the button on the right, pre-tone, there was no difference in the EEG, which indicates that no decision was made yet. After the tone, you get a difference in the EEG. So the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. You get more activity on the right when the left button moves, and so on. So that indicates that the time between the time between intention formation and action is, again, around the W time, around 200 milliseconds. So Libet didn't really give us a good reason to identify the time of the ramp-up starting with the time of the decision. And when you look for independent evidence, it goes the other way. So it doesn't take anything like, apparently, 550 milliseconds for a proximal decision to cause corresponding muscle motion. And then I think to save time, I could just say a little bit about the other two studies. I mean, one thing to notice is if we have evidence that these decisions aren't made until about 200 milliseconds before muscle motion, then we have evidence that the decisions are not made 7 to 10 seconds in advance or 800 milliseconds in advance. So we don't really need to worry much about those other two or at all. But you might wonder, and of course I would wonder, so what is going on in those studies? What's going on 7 to 10 seconds in advance of muscle motion or 800 milliseconds or whatever? And a very plausible answer is a process is up and running in the brain that is geared eventually to cause a decision of the kind that's required, but it's still open at what time that decision will be made. So it looks like people could decide differently than they do. So anyway, okay, that's one problem that all of these studies face, Libet's study and then all the successor studies. Now, sometimes when I've done this, I've persuaded people, and sometimes they say, yeah, you're right. You know, we don't have good evidence that the decisions are made that early, but you know what? The point of no return is made that early. So in Libet's studies, the point of no return is hit a little more than half a second before muscle motion. And the point of no return here is the point at which, once a process reaches it, it's just going to grind on and produce the result, unless something really exceptional happens, like you have a stroke, you know, right then. But without any kind of weird stuff, the point of no return is hit. And then the claim is, well, you know, once that point of no return is hit, what that amounts to is that the decision, when it happens, is going to be deterministically caused. It's going to be inevitably caused. And if it's deterministically or inevitably caused, they claim, then it's not free. It's not freely made because it's determined. Now, I'm not going to talk about compatibilism here. Some of you know about that. But that's a theoretical issue I'm not going to go into. So we have this question. Is the point of no return hit that early? From Libet's data, given his methodology, you can't get evidence for when the point of no return happens. And that's because when you do studies of the kind he did, you need to do what's called back averaging. You need to give the computer a signal that tells it to make a record of the preceding second or two of brain activity. So unless there is, and then what he used as the signal was the muscle motion. So when there's muscle motion and only when there's muscle motion, a signal is sent to the computer to make a record of the preceding second or so of brain activity. When there's no muscle motion, there's no signal. So what you want to do when you're looking for the point of no return is see whether you ever get a signal that looks like Libet's signal, the one that starts a little over half a second before muscle motion, and looks like Libet's signal for, let's say, 300 milliseconds, and then peters out, let's say. Does that ever happen? If that does happen, then the point of no return isn't at that early time. The point of no return couldn't be until later. And Libet's methodology doesn't give you a way to look into that. Let's see if I'm supposed to be switching. Yeah, good. And then the Schulze-Kraft study. So it was a stop signal study, very cleverly designed. In a book of mine, Effective Intentions, it was published in 2009, I suggested that people should do a stop signal study to see when the point of no return is hit in cases like this. And I just suggested a really simple one, which is easy to explain, simple study. So you can use a Libet clock and tell people to, let's say, press a button when the clock hits the 9 o'clock point. And you say, do that unless you hear a beep before it. And then you can move that beep around in time. You can move it like 10 milliseconds before the 9 o'clock point, or 50, or whatever, 200, and see when the beep can be effective and when not. And if the person can refrain from pressing the button when the beep sounds at a certain time, that's evidence that the point of no return hasn't been hit yet. Okay, so what these guys did is a fancy version of a study like that, and without giving you the details, the average time of effectiveness, of the latest effectiveness, of a stop signal was 200 milliseconds before muscle motion. So again, we're around the 200 millisecond point, which is allegedly the point of first awareness of the decision or intention. So it looks like the point of no return isn't hit before that. It could be hit around then. And then what you might think is, well, you know, that's the beep that's being effective, but what does that tell us about what people can do when they're not responding to anything external? Well, if a beep can stop you from acting on an urge, say, what about yourself, self-control? And I think, you know, we do have this kind of self-control. You might have an urge to yell at somebody or say something rude or even worse and not do it. You cancel it, you veto it. Okay, all right, so good. Oh, and then if this is going to work for 550, you know, it's going to work for these later times too, so I don't really have to go into the other two studies. Now, the third problem, suppose you think, well, let's not do it that way. Let's say, just suppose that everything that I said is wrong, and really Libet had shown that in his studies, the decision is made at minus 550 milliseconds. Then we don't even have to worry about the point of no return. What then? Well, there is a problem. Let's see. Yeah, I think I want to do it this way. So it's a generalization problem, and I guess I wanted to start with my experience as a subject. So years ago, I think it was 2005, I went to our National Institutes of Health, whose budget has been cut a lot recently, and gave a lecture on, well, free will and neuroscience to a motor control group. And the idea was I would give my lecture, then we'd go to the lab, and they would hook me up for a Libet-style study. And then when we were done with that, I would go out to dinner. They would take me out to dinner. So I did the lecture, we did the Q&A, went to the lab, got wired up, and I wanted to be a naive subject and do whatever a naive subject would do. So I was sitting there, I was watching the clock, and I was waiting for an intention to pop up or a desire or urge or whatever, and nothing was coming to mind. And I thought, what am I going to do, and how do people do this? And so I hit upon the following strategy. I would say now silently to myself and treat that as a go signal. And then as I was watching the clock, try to pay attention to where it was when I silently said now. Now, I had something really definite to look for. It was this silent now saying. I mean, you know, you can all do that, right? Other people don't have that in the normal studies. I mean, they'd have to make it up for themselves. So anyway, but the important point for present purposes is just that what I was doing was arbitrarily picking a time to press or flex. And all of the choices in these studies are arbitrary choices, where nothing really recommends one moment over another. Now, I'm going to skip Buridan's ass. There's a view in philosophy called restrictivism. It's not a majority view, but it's a view some important philosophers have held, according to which free will can only enter the scene when there's a certain kind of conflict within the individual, a conflict between what you judge it morally right to do and what you feel like doing, for example, or a conflict between long-term self-interest, short-term pleasure. And these philosophers say it's only in those kinds of cases that you can even use free will. Now, if that's right, then none of these studies about arbitrary picking are even relevant to free will. But, you know, suppose the restrictivists are wrong and free will can extend to arbitrary picking. Well, even then, arbitrary picking seems so different from thoughtful choosing that it would be very difficult to generalize from what you found in arbitrary picking cases to serious decisions that we make, like a decision about whether to seek a divorce now or later, a decision about whether to hide your cell phone when you go back to the U.S., you know, and so on and so on. So things you think about a lot. And it may be that when we do consciously reason about what to do, we're much more likely to make conscious decisions than otherwise. So, so we have really three different kinds of problem here. First, none of these studies show that the decisions are made at these early times, that they're made unconsciously. None of the studies show that the point of no return is hit before conscious awareness of a decision. And then third, even if the studies did show things like this, the studies are only about arbitrary decisions, and we can't generalize from the claim about them to this claim about all decisions, that all decisions are made unconsciously. And I think I did that in a half hour, so I'm happy. Oh, but I should show you one more slide, probably. Oh, that's just promotional stuff. We don't need it. Okay, so I'm done. That's the end.
Thank you very much for this fascinating perspective. And now I would like to ask Anne Sophie Meincke to give her presentation. And here, so Anne Sophie, to introduce her a little bit to who doesn't know her yet, she's a senior research fellow in philosophy at the University of Vienna. She's interested in metaphysics, the philosophy of biology, and the philosophy of mind and action. And she's presently leading a Elise Richter project on the biological functions of free will. She has won 2014 a prize for scientific research at the University of Innsbruck and 2020 a prize for women in logic and philosophy of science by the Italian Society for Logic and Philosophy of Science. She's a member of the Young Academy since 2020 and has served on the board of the Young Academy since 2022. And from what I heard from Anne Sophie so far, she's taking a dynamic approach to how biology affects free will. So without further ado,
thank you very much, Alice, for this kind introduction, and thank you, Al, very much for your briefing about why Liebe doesn't work as people think. That's pretty much telling us why science hasn't disproved free will, and I'm going to try now to persuade you that actually there are scientific arguments in favor of free will. But let's start with some conceptual clarifications, as philosophers like to do. Well, I gather that you had the freedom of action to attend this lecture. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. So that's to say, you were free to do what you wanted to do. So that implies, thank God, nobody tied you to your office chair, preventing you from enacting your wish to attend this lecture. And equally, also nobody has taken away your freedom not to attend this lecture by dragging you here against your will. Or at least that's what I hope. Now, how about your free will? Were you free to want to attend this lecture? And that's quite a different question. So, for example, could you have wanted to do something else? Oh, I'm sure that's the case. Well, I'm sure that you actually did want to do at least, say, 2 other things, like staying at the office, get some work done, or have a nice stroll through Palace Schönbrunn. Well, you thought about whether or not to do that, whether that's really what you wanted, or, well, ultimately you came to the conclusion, no, what you really wanted was attending Elsa my lecture. And obviously, we very much appreciate your decision. So, free will, I think, is just exactly this ability to choose which of the many wants that you happen to have, and we always have many wishes, we unfortunately cannot enact all of them, which one it is that you actually want to act on. And as you were considering what to do, like office, Schönbrunn, or lecture, you took it for granted that these possibilities are actually also open to your decision. And that's because otherwise there would not have been any point in considering the possibilities, right? What to do. So, and that's known in philosophy circles, oh, sorry, I'm too quick, as the principle of alternative possibilities. Unfortunately, this notion of free will in this robust sense that implies alternative possibilities. Sorry, I'm going in the wrong way. Here we are. This strong, and we call it a libertarian sense of free will that entails the principle of alternative possibilities faces a dilemma. Inspired by classical physics, many metaphysicians and scientists believe in what is called universal determinism. So that's the idea that at every moment in time there's actually only one possible future, one possible future state of the entire universe. That's why it's called universal determinism. And unfortunately, that means, and that's because of the laws of nature, they're deterministic and so on, that's the story that's being told. So if that's true, right, then nobody could ever have wanted and acted differently than they actually did. So that means from the beginning of the universe, it was determined by the laws of nature that on the 10th of June in 22, you would want to attend this lecture and decide to do so. Yeah, that's a crazy view, isn't it? Well, metaphysicians tend to be a bit crazy. Then some people are reasonable and they say, well, that's sort of not really credible. How about indeterminism? Do things look better? I mean, obviously, we need alternative possibilities, so we assume that universal determinism is false and we subscribe to indeterminism. Unfortunately, there's a new problem now, as so often in philosophy. Doesn't it look then as if our actions were just a matter of chance? So how you decide? So it was just like a random decision to attend this lecture? That doesn't look like free will, and some people really get desperate then, and like our friend Peter van Inwegen, he thinks, and so he's a libertarian, right? Free will is really a mystery. It exists even though it's actually not possible. Weird. I think this is a good a situation, a classical situation, when we get into such a dilemma that we need a fresh start. And that's what I suggest. Let's get help from biology. Now, you might wonder, why biology? Well, because we are evolved biological beings, right? You know the story? And biology is the science that studies evolved biological beings. So my consideration is actually a very simple one. If we have free will, then free will must be the result of evolution. And if so, then it's likely that free will has some biological function, which we also could study. Now, our evolutionary history and continuity with other species also suggest that we should broaden our perspective and ask, what about non-human organisms? Perhaps we are not the only living beings with free will? Let us take up this point right away. So I brought 3 short videos for you, which I hope will run in this presentation. And I want you to participate, right? This is a public lecture. It means like the public also has to do something. I will ask you 2 questions, and you just do thumbs up or thumbs down for yes or no. And please don't think, just react spontaneously, all right? Ready? Good. Can you see that? So the snail getting in touch with water and immediately retracting its antenna. So my question for you is, does the snail, as we see it acting here, have free will and exert free will? Okay. Well, okay, perhaps I should formulate the question a little bit more precisely, so saying, is this, okay, well, I shouldn't preempt is what we observe, the behavior that we observe, is that an exertion of free will? Okay, so the majority, well, some people say yes. Most people say no. Thanks very much. And now there's a second question, and I almost ruined it. Do you think that the behavior that we're observing here is an action? Many people don't know. Yes, there's lots of thumbs up. There's a okay, so you say, okay, up to the point it touches the water, there's free will, and afterwards it's just, we'll talk about that. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Okay, thanks very much. Next one. Again, I probably have to be very precise. How about the tiger? Is that free will? Oh, say yes. Some people say no. Very mixed opinions. How about the duck? I'm surprised about that. We need to talk about that. Okay. Great, thanks. And how about agency? Who thinks that the tiger is performing an action? Oh, yeah, most people think so. And the dog? Who? Great. All right, that's interesting, yes. And now last one. So, just focusing on the guy in this case. does he exert free will? Oh, some guys say no. Okay, we need more context. Well, I told you, don't think about it. Spontaneous reactions, please, just spontaneous. Okay, I'm not asking about women in this case. So who thinks that this is action, what he's doing? Okay, everybody agrees. Good, okay. Well, there's a reason why I asked you 2 questions. Not only one, even though this is a lecture about free will, but I had my reason to ask you about agency as well, because ascribing free will to something presupposes that this is an agent, right? So there would be no point if I tried to persuade you that this standing desk here had free will, because everybody agrees, well, it can't have free will because it doesn't act, it's not an agent. Right? So we need agency for free will. Well, that's the reason why none of you voted for free will with respect to any of the scenarios that I showed you, without also voting in favor of agency. Right. But the dependency relation also explain why many of you who denied free will to non-human animals also denied them agency. Right? So if animals can't perform actions, then they can't have free will. And that's actually a very ancient idea. And I'm showing you this guy because basically that's all traced back to him. Descartes, mathematician and philosopher. He had this idea that animals, unlike humans, lack minds. And why is that? Well, because Descartes thought that there are actually only 2 types of thinking in the entire universe, right? If you look at the universe from a very general point of view, and you try to categorize things, and you come up with, all right, there's something that he called res extenda, like extended things, matter, and there are the thinking things, res cogitans, minds, right? And then he thought, well, actually, most of the universe is just this matter, then there might be God, who's a mind, and humans are special because their minds somehow contingently attached to a body. And he made this argument, which is famous, so philosophers call it substance dualism, well, that actually animals, non-human animals, are like machines, and they can't have minds because they don't have language, right? So, yeah, let's not go into this. He had this idea that language is somehow the sign of the thinking mind. He thought that animals don't speak, so, well, they can't have minds. But the thing that is relevant for us is, well, he also thought that agency requires deliberation, which obviously requires a mind, but because animals don't have minds, they also can't have agency. And so it just looks, he thinks, as if they were agents because they move around. But robots, or like the machines that people at that time started to invent, they also moved around. So he thought, yeah, that's just the very same thing, right? The animals just move around, but that's not agency because they don't have minds. Right. Well, Descartes' idea that animals don't have minds did a lot of harm and continued to do so even after it was effectively refuted by this guy here, Charles Darwin. His discovery of the evolutionary history of the human species obviously debunks Cartesian substance dualism, because we're animals too, after all, right? Right? This is not going away. And he added, well, any difference that there might be between humans and animals cannot be a matter of kind, difference of kind, but just degree. And he explicitly got a bit obsessed with earthworms towards the end of his life. He studied them in detail. Very funny, he wrote an entire book about it, which almost nobody knows. And he really thought these are intelligent creatures. And that really persuaded him to say what is here on the slide. Difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind. It took quite a while for this to get a bit of traction. Around like 150 years later now, his message somehow got to fruition, as ever shown by the new field of animal cognition, cognitive biology, behavior cognitive biologist here, and I really want to advertise her book for everybody who can read German. Look into this. At least it really shows us how intelligent and innovative and creative animals, non-human animals. And also in the philosophy of biology, people now start to think about whether there could be something like biological agency, like non-human agency. It's a bit of a controversial subject still, but people consider it. You may say, well, that's all fine. Perhaps animals have minds. Perhaps they even are agents. But that doesn't show that they have free will. We need more for free will. And I could see that there was quite a majority of you denying free will to some of the, or well, most of the non-human animals while granting them agency. Now, why is that? What is behind that? And I think it has something to do with what got very much debated some time ago, the idea of animal instinct, right? So the presumption that animals are largely driven by instincts, that is like innate predispositions for wide stereotype patterns of behavior that are triggered by stimuli. And because we're in Vienna, I should mention Konrad Lorenz, who was one of the people who really popularized this view. I should also mention that he was a Nazi and quite a difficult figure, but nevertheless, okay, give him credit for that kind of work. He did not deny that animals also learn, but he thought that really most of animal behavior that we somehow perceive, observe, is just innate. Thereby he opposed, well, that's the grey-legged goose he worked with. He opposed behaviorism, right? That's the idea that organisms are blank states and that basically all behavior is learned, whereas while behavior learning is understood as a conditioning process, right? So you all know this dog here, he's being conditioned into reacting to the ring of a bell, And why is this important? Well, it looks like, regardless of whether you think that animal behavior is just instinct or whether it's just conditioned, there are no alternative possibilities here. So it seems like, okay, these are agents, but for whatever reason, either one or the other, they don't have free will. And it's also easy to see how this view can be extended to include humans if you sort of also assume, especially the instinct theory, if you assume that all that instincts are sort of based in the genetic makeup of organisms, right? And somebody, probably everybody in this room has somehow heard of, that's Richard Dawkins, who thinks that basically genes are selfish replicators who just use organisms as their vehicles for their self-replication. And then you can make this even broader and assume that behavior is that way determined. That's then a view called like sociobiology. You end up with a really strange view that sort of justifies the status quo, including patriarchy, like because apparently, I mean, that's the wrong claim, because in prehistoric societies, the men did the hunting and the ladies stayed at home. It's wrong, actually, it's not true. But because this that's just like what genetics makes us do. So it's fine. Just we could just leave it at that. Well, well, you cannot give a talk about free will without mentioning Robert Sapolsky here. Put the two things together, genetic determinism and learning as a social conditioning, and add a questionable view of causation. And then you end up with this view that Robert Sapolsky has popularized in his book, many books, but the most recent one is this one. And I just read this quote: the intent you form, the person you are, is the result of all the interactions between biology and environment that came before, all things out of your control. So each prior influence flows without a break from the effects of the influence before. As such, there's no point in the sequence where you can insert a freedom of will that will be in that biological world, but not of it. And this last line is really telling. So, of course, if you perceive the world as being a fully deterministic place, well, what space would there be for free will? So free will ends up being the supernatural thing, perhaps residing in a material, immortal soul or something, right? And then you can use this to sort of argue against free will as a whole, and you end up with this denialism and the thesis that science has proved that free will doesn't exist. Now, here's the good news. Biological determinism is false. And therefore, there is open space for a biological notion of free will that does not invoke immortal souls and other spooky metaphysics. Now you might be really puzzled and ask, how come we haven't heard anything about biological determinism being false? And how come that it is false? Well, the answer to the first question is that media just love this determinism story. They just love to, because it gets many clicks, right? It just sells so well to tell, apparently, I don't know actually why, because I don't like that message, but if you tell people, you don't have free will and science has proved it, oh God, they get so many clicks. It's, much more attractive for them, much more attractive for them to continue to tell this false story rather than going into the details of the more complex truth. Okay, so what is the more complex truth? Well, we now know that there is no one-to-one relationship between genotype and phenotype, right? So how the phenotype really turns out is the result of a very complex interplay between genomic and environmental factors, right? So it's environmental factors that decide about which genes are expressed and how, when, what is switched on. We also know there's large genomic networks being involved. I know there are people here who study this. So it's much more complicated than that, right? And there's a real impact that the environment has on how these processes turn out. And then tells me, what do genes do? Basically, they instruct cells to build proteins. They tell them how to build proteins, and that's what they do, right? They don't tell the cell, oh, tell the organism to behave like that or that, this, right? So there are no genes for aggression, for fear, or for, I don't know, criminality or something. Well, even though people still continue to look for them. That's just not the scientific truth. It's a nice story that sells well, but it's not the truth. So that means that we cannot predict. We can't predict how an organism develops if we just know the genome, nor can we predict, and let alone can we predict how it will behave. And also, we now know that instincts are not genetically determined in the way that people used to think. There seems to be a window in which they are being established, and experience plays a role, and even later in life, after the development phase, instincts can be modulated by experience. They can also be suppressed, etc. So that's not an argument against free will. And what we can see is that there's a real paradigm shift now underway in evolutionary biology, because obviously if we ditch genetic determinism, we get to a totally different view of what evolution is like, right? So it's not just driven by genes and random mutations, as people used to think, but there's much more involved. So once we start to appreciate the role of the environment, well, then we come to see, oh my God, perhaps evolution has many more dimensions, right? And that's what very smart biologists are in the process of figuring out. So this is Kevin Layler. I had a big project on the so-called extended evolutionary synthesis. So it's really important to acknowledge that epigenetic factors and organism-environment interactions play a role, and that there's really more to heredity than genes, and that's a contribution made by biologist Eva Jablonka and colleagues. She really emphasizes that there are at least 4 dimensions of inheritance: genetic, epigenetic, also behavioral and symbolic. So to make sense of it, so it's just like behavior can be transmitted to following subsequent generations, obviously through the parents being like the larger community of animals. And that is really relevant. So if you do have a group of very smart, like smart behavior in a certain group, that affects how what their reproductive success is and their fitness. And equally, so that goes into the social realm, in human symbolic knowledge is very important, like things like language and culture, they affect how our evolution goes. Right? It can also go pretty wrong, as we see it today. Something is wrong, the way we treat the environment, so we should really think the way we construct our niche. So that's the slogan under which this is being discussed. Organisms really contribute to their own evolution by changing the environments in which they live. Right? So that means that there is an active role played by organisms. So they are agents. Right? They're not passive sides of evolution where some genetics play out. No, it's really, therefore it really matters, and we see it as concerning the human species. It really matters how we behave and whether we will be around for the next 100 years or not, right? It's part of our evolution. Now, this fact, and the growing recognition of the active agential role that organisms play in their individual lives, but also in evolution, that really speaks to the fact that organisms are dynamic systems, and it underpins a broader what I call process metaphysical view of at least biological reality. I mean, I'm a little bit more radical. I think actually our entire world is dynamic. Today our topic is organisms and their free will. Organisms are dynamic systems. So what does it mean? If you look at it in thermodynamical terms, organisms are open systems that maintain a stability far from thermodynamic equilibrium. And how does this work? Well, they interact with the environment in ways that extract energy from the environment. And they have to do this all the time. That means there is always a change going on, and without this change, an organism would collapse. Right? The most fundamental way in which organisms change is the metabolism. Right? If your metabolism breaks down, then that's your end. And, well, as a philosopher, I would say, well, what is this? What is this kind of entity that needs to change in order to exist? Well, that's what we call a process, right? It's not a thing that just sits there and can be there without doing anything. No, a process really only exists insofar as it's changing and moving, right? Like you could compare it to an eddy in the sea. And obviously, an organism is not just any process. It's a complex process, right? It's orchestrated. I speak of a higher order process because there's a dependence, emergence, and dependence relation between constituting processes, and the overall result, so you change at different layers in reality. And the important thing is this process is interactive self-stabilization. So you've got here a process that stabilizes itself only through interacting with other processes. And that's a kind of agency, right? Obviously, you can see there's some basic forms of agency, and people could quibble about whether it's true agency, and we will have to talk about agency. Some people are very liberal and say, yeah, metabolism is also an agency. Well, other people say, no, it's not intentional, it's not, right? But you can see, if you compare, say, going hunting for a prey, that contributes to metabolism. It gives it food. Well, if there's nothing to digest, there's no metabolism. It's not the same, but if you compare the function, I mean, both contribute to the self-constitution, the interactive self-stabilization of the organism in question. And I think, and that's something I'm going to talk about in more detail tomorrow at the conference in my talk, and who's interested should really come along to the conference. I think this really suggests a different way of thinking about agency and causation, so like how actions are caused. I think we can show on this basis that this common stimulus-response model of action causation is false, right? So that's the model that underlies ideas about instincts and conditioning. So it's always this idea that an action is like a triggered response to a stimulus. Right, so I think that's just not the way it looks. It looks much more messy, but that's my attempt to visualize it. What you see here is the organism that stabilizes itself through interacting with the environment. So at the same time, you've got a demarcation between different processes, but there's not like an insulation that really cuts the organism off from the environment. So that gives us reason to think that an action is caused by an agent in the light of experience, and that's a very different thing from being triggered into a response. And so, what does it mean to perform an action informed by experience? Well, it just means identifying and choosing between different possibilities. So I think it's not only the case that you can't have free will without agency. I also think it's the other way around too. You can't have agency without a minimal form, at least, of free will. And so I would like to give you my view of how we should think of the three scenarios I showed you. I think they are all instantiations of the same phenomenon in different degrees. Right? So what you get here is the freer an action is, the more pronounced also is the character of being an action, right? Because and that has something to do with the way alternative possibilities are being imagined and chosen. And if we just go through this, obviously, here in the human case, that's the freest. I'm not saying that it's always like that and that we're generally the freest creatures, but looking at this situation, or at least that's what we would hope, that this gentleman here has thought well about what to do and that he's got reasons. So basically, in that case, the decision very much relies on deliberation, right? And that's a bit different with this case here, with the tiger and the duck, where there's more perception. I'm not saying this is like only perception or only deliberation. We know that there might be precognitive states in animals, so Alice knows about that. And actually, there's also an element of chance, right? So it might be chance a decision by the, on the duck side, whether to dive left or right, but it doesn't matter. It's nevertheless intelligible, right? Why the duck does this. And, well, the furthest removed from proper free will, as we would say, is the snail, but I still think it's minimally free. And that's actually, if I were to spell this out, and I will do this tomorrow in my talk, there's a long story about how to interpret reflex actions. I think it's a limit case of an action. But what gives me the reason to say, well, still minimal freedom here involved, is that there's an evolutionary history to this, the development or the evolution of this reflex. So I have this theory, and there's some empirical evidence that actually also reflex actions are secondary phenomena, right? So somehow evolution figured out in the past it was a good idea to retract the antenna from the water, and then it got secondarily hardwired. But biologists might correct me on this, but I think there's good reason for that. Well, so it's time to sum up. Biology, I think, is really the key to solving the free will dilemma. First, oh, I'm too quick again. What's happening? Oh, no, I almost had skipped a slide, which is very important. Free will as a biological function. I could talk endlessly about the continuum model. Don't have the time for this today. What I think that the continuum model shows us is that free will has a biological function and also what it consists in. Organisms have to act to survive in an indeterministic world. And free will, so that's the ability to determine one's own will and to make decisions and acting one's wishes, that really has evolved in order to optimize individuals' adaptation to the environment at the behavioral level, right? You've got different strategies how to adapt to environment. You can do this by restructuring your body, but you can also do it by perform smart behavior, right? And this is what free will is for, right? So really, if you think about and you consider unstable environments, environments that have a lot of changing what's happening around the organism, well, then it's just a smart idea to allow the organism to make up its own mind about how to react in a given situation, right? Rather than hardwiring this, because you can't have a hardwired connection for every possible thing that comes onto you in the environment. So it's better to allow the organism perceive it, assess it, make a decision, right? So, and that gives you flexibility, and that is crucial if you want to survive. So what you really don't want to be in a changeable environment is being predictable, because that makes you an easy prey, and Björn has lots of nice material about that. So that's not to say that reflex mechanisms or actions are dysfunctional. On the contrary, I think they make a lot of sense in boring environments where there's not a lot of change, because then you don't need brain power for thinking about what to do. You know already what's the best thing, so you can hardwire it, right? So evolutionary speaking, it's a later phenomenon, and it somehow has interesting similarities with habitualized actions. So if you, for example, get yourself to get up every morning 6 o'clock and go to the gym, well, it's a little bit like, you really succeed if you make that a habit and like a reflex response, right? But it's learning. It's added learning, not as conditioning, but as the deliberate decision to minimize or reduce the number of your possibilities, so that you don't think about the alternative like, oh, I could also stay in bed. You don't think about that. You just act. You get up and run to the gym, right? I could talk much more about learning here. I will not do this for reasons of time. The takeaway message really is free will in all its degrees and appearances helps us maximize biological fitness. So that's what it has evolved for, and it's supported by the co-evolution of nervous systems and brains. And if you want to know more about that, come to the conference. We've got exciting neurobiologists here. We'll talk about that. And now it's really time to sum up. Okay, again, biology is the key to solving the free will dilemma. And at the very first, I think we can really forget about universal determinism. That's a metaphysical fiction. I've never understood why people actually would think that. So, okay, let's ditch it. And I also talked about biological determinism, which is a more tangible version of determinism. And this is false, as I've shown you. Yeah, empirical evidence against it. So biology, biological reality at the very least, is indeterministic. And that leaves us now with the indeterministic horn of our dilemma. So the question is, can free will be reconciled with indeterminism? And I really hope I have shown that's the case. So if we approach the matter through the lens of biology, right? So already in conceptual terms, if you think about it, indeterminism is just a negation of universal determinism. So that's all. It's not to say that everything is chaos. It's just, all right, it's not everything is universally deterministic. So there's space for alternative possibilities. So the future is open. That's the main thing about it. And when it comes to biological indeterminism, I mean, we've seen there can be different various centers of order, and we've seen that there are different degrees of order that actually correspond to different degrees of free will and agency. And we've also seen, and that was an example with the dog, it's fine for some acts to be random in a certain sense, right? So for chance to be involved, there's also actually evidence that chance is being harnessed by nervous systems, brains, in order to produce a useful adaptive behavior. So it doesn't undermine the intelligibility of an action if there's a little bit of chance. So, therefore, I also would like to contradict dear Peter van Inwegen. I don't think that free will is a mystery. It's a biological function of bioagents. It's grounded in the processual constitution of living systems and also open to scientific explanation. So as a biological function of free will is the product of evolution, and as well as what has shaped evolution and continues to do so. And I would like to close, free will is real and biology explains why, and I would like to close with a more speculative note and a quote from philosopher Henri Bergson. The role of life is to insert some indetermination into matter. Indeterminate, that is unforeseeable, are the forms it creates in the course of its evolution. More and more indeterminate also, more and more free, is the activity to which these forms serve as the vehicle. Thank you very much for your attention.